She said she needed to know if this was really it, right there in front of everyone at our 5-year anniversary celebration. The thing is, I'd spent months planning this party at our downtown loft, thinking we were celebrating the foundation of something permanent. I was wrong about a lot of things that night, but mostly I was wrong about Grace. I watched her work the room that evening, moving between clusters of friends and family with the practiced grace of someone who knew exactly how good she looked in that emerald dress I'd helped her pick out 3 weeks earlier. Our loft overlooked the city lights, and I'd strung cafe lights across the exposed brick walls, hired the jazz trio she'd mentioned loving after a concert we'd attended last spring, even tracked down that specific Pinot Noir from our second date at the Little Bistro in North Beach. 80 people had gathered to celebrate what I thought was our shared future, including my parents who'd flown in from Portland and her entire extended family who'd driven up from Sacramento. Grace had insisted on inviting her college sorority sisters, 6 women I'd met exactly twice who spent the evening taking selfies and making pointed comments about engagement timelines. The whole crowd was a mix of our closest relationships and people who seemed more interested in documenting the evening than actually celebrating it. Grace moved through them all with that magnetic energy that had first attracted me, but tonight something felt different, more performative than genuine. She pulled me aside near the balcony around 9:30, positioning us perfectly within earshot of those sorority sisters who were pretending to admire the panoramic view while obviously straining to catch every word of what they assumed would be a romantic private moment. The calculated staging should have been my first clue, but I was still thinking like someone in a partnership rather than someone being set up for public humiliation. Grace whispered that she'd been having doubts about everything, about us, about whether we were just going through the motions because everyone expected it. She said she felt trapped by the timeline everyone had imposed on us, that maybe we needed to slow down and figure out if this was what we both really wanted or if we were just following some predetermined script. Her voice carried just enough for her audience to hear the key phrases about feeling trapped and needing space, and I realized this wasn't a private conversation but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to justify whatever narrative she'd been building about our relationship to anyone who would listen. When she declared loud enough for witnesses that she needed to know if this is really it, if we were settling for comfortable instead of chasing something extraordinary, I felt something shift inside me like a mechanism clicking into place. The humiliation was intentional, the timing calculated to maximize embarrassment, the audience handpicked to spread her version of events. I looked at her face in the soft light of those cafe lights I'd hung with such hope earlier that afternoon, and I saw a stranger who'd been planning this moment while I'd been planning our wedding, someone who'd been coaching her friends on how to react supportively when she revealed her doubts. So I gave her exactly what she wanted, just not how she'd scripted it. I stepped back, raised my voice slightly but clearly, and announced to all 80 guests that our engagement was over because Grace was having serious doubts about everything we'd built together over the past 5 years and felt we needed to go our separate ways. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the jazz trio continuing their romantic set in the background, completely oblivious to the fact that they were now providing the soundtrack to the most public breakup of my life. Grace's face went white, then red, as she realized I'd taken control of her carefully planned narrative and flipped it entirely, turning her moment of dramatic revelation into something that made her look indecisive and cruel rather than brave and honest. This wasn't how her script was supposed to end, and the confused whispers from her sorority sisters confirmed that even her backup chorus didn't know how to react to this plot twist. I returned to my minimalist downtown apartment the next morning and began dismantling our wedding plans with the same systematic precision I used for marine engineering projects. The vineyard in Napa Valley came first, 18 months of advance booking that had required a substantial deposit and multiple site visits where Grace had photographed herself among the vines for her social media posts about our perfect future. The venue coordinator sounded genuinely sorry when I explained the engagement was off, but the cancellation fee was non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. Next came the jazz quartet we'd hired after attending 3 different auditions, musicians Grace had chosen because they reminded her of the soundtrack from her favorite romantic movie. Then the artisanal catering company that specialized in farm-to-table presentations, complete with locally sourced ingredients and hand-calligraphed menu cards that Grace had spent weeks perfecting the wording for. The vintage car rental for our getaway transportation, a 1960s Mustang convertible in seafoam green that Grace had insisted would make for incredible photographs, required a phone call to a collector in Sonoma who'd been looking forward to showcasing his restoration work at our celebration. Each cancellation felt like surgically removing pieces of a future I'd believed in completely, but the mechanical nature of the task kept me focused on logistics rather than emotions. The financial hit was substantial, thousands in forfeited deposits that represented months of careful saving, but the relief of not having to pretend everything was fine felt worth every lost dollar. My phone buzzed constantly with concerned calls from family members who'd witnessed the previous night's disaster, text messages from friends asking if I was okay, voicemails from Grace's relatives who seemed more confused than sympathetic about the sudden change in plans. I activated airplane mode and spent the rest of the day methodically erasing every trace of our shared future from my living space. The engagement photos came down from their frames on the mantelpiece, replaced by the original artwork I'd stored in the closet when Grace moved in her collection of inspirational quote prints. Her skincare products vanished from the bathroom counter, her carefully curated selection of throw pillows disappeared from the couch, and her vision board of wedding inspiration got rolled up and placed by the door with the rest of her belongings I'd gathered into neat boxes. The most satisfying moment came when I discovered she'd already contacted several vendors herself in the days before our anniversary party, placing holds on potential cancellations just in case things didn't go according to whatever plan she'd been crafting. The florist mentioned that Grace had called 3 days earlier asking about their cancellation policy, and the photographer revealed she'd requested information about postponing rather than rescheduling, as if she'd been building herself an escape route while I'd been building us a wedding. This revelation transformed my methodical dismantling from a painful necessity into something that felt more like uncovering evidence of a betrayal that had been planned long before that balcony conversation. The clinical precision of my actions became a meditation on reclaiming control over a narrative I'd never realized I was losing, and by evening my apartment felt like mine again for the first time in months. 3 days later, Grace arrived unannounced at my apartment with the kind of calculated vulnerability that had always been her specialty, standing in my doorway wearing sweatpants and an oversized sweater that made her look smaller and more fragile than the confident woman who'd orchestrated our public breakup. She demanded to know why I'd overreacted to what she called normal pre-wedding jitters, positioning herself as the reasonable adult trying to navigate complex emotions while I was apparently too emotionally stunted to handle honest communication about our relationship. The performance was masterful in its execution, complete with carefully timed pauses and strategic eye contact that suggested I was witnessing genuine vulnerability rather than another calculated manipulation. She explained that she'd only needed reassurance about the big step we were taking, that any mature partner would have recognized her concerns as natural anxiety rather than fundamental doubts about our compatibility. According to Grace's revised narrative, she'd been trying to create space for us to have an adult conversation about the pressures everyone was putting on us to follow a traditional timeline, but I'd chosen to humiliate her publicly instead of engaging with her legitimate concerns about whether we were rushing into marriage because of external expectations rather than genuine readiness. The gaslighting was breathtaking in its audacity, transforming her calculated public confrontation into my failure to provide emotional support during her moment of understandable uncertainty. She accused me of being emotionally unavailable throughout our entire relationship, someone who preferred planning logistics to actually connecting with the person I claimed to love, and suggested that my immediate jump to canceling everything proved I'd been looking for an excuse to escape rather than fight for what we'd built together. The irony of someone who'd spent weeks planning our breakup accusing me of avoiding difficult conversations wasn't lost on me, but Grace delivered her accusations with the righteous indignation of someone who genuinely believed her own revised version of events. She insisted that couples who truly loved each other worked through doubts and fears together instead of abandoning ship at the first sign of complexity, and that my willingness to immediately dismantle our future proved I'd never been as committed as I'd pretended to be. The manipulation was so sophisticated that for a moment I almost found myself questioning whether I had overreacted, whether her public staging had been my misinterpretation of someone genuinely struggling with cold feet rather than someone orchestrating maximum humiliation. That's when I calmly revealed that I'd found the draft messages on her laptop, still logged into our shared cloud account that I hadn't thought to check until after she'd moved out her immediate belongings. The messages told a completely different story than the one she was trying to sell, detailed scripts for different scenarios at the anniversary party, complete with coaching notes for her sorority sisters about how to react supportively when she revealed her doubts about our future. There were backup plans for various responses I might give, strategies for positioning herself as the brave one willing to ask hard questions while making me look either controlling or emotionally immature depending on how I handled her revelation. She'd even practiced different ways to phrase her concerns to maximize the impact on our audience while maintaining plausible deniability about her true intentions. When Grace saw the printouts I'd made of her planning documents, her carefully constructed mask of wounded vulnerability finally cracked completely. She broke down and admitted she'd felt overwhelmed by everyone's expectations and the pressure of planning a wedding that felt more like a performance than a celebration, but insisted that her love for me was real even if her methods had been misguided. The tears were genuine this time, but they came too late and for all the wrong reasons. I quietly explained that love doesn't orchestrate public humiliation for personal clarity, that someone who truly cared about their partner doesn't spend weeks planning the most devastating way to reveal their doubts while pretending everything was fine. I told her that whatever anxiety she'd been feeling about our future, there had been countless opportunities for private conversations that didn't require an audience of 80 people to witness my destruction. As I asked her to leave and walked her to the door, I explained that I was changing all my passwords and removing her access to every shared account, effectively erasing our digital entanglement forever so she couldn't plan any more surprise revelations using information meant to be private between partners who trusted each other. I threw myself into my work as a marine engineering consultant with the kind of focused intensity that had gotten me through graduate school, taking on additional projects that required me to analyze offshore platform specifications and calculate load-bearing requirements for coastal infrastructure developments. The mechanical predictability of engineering problems became my refuge from the emotional chaos Grace had introduced into my life, and I found genuine satisfaction in solving complex structural challenges that had clear parameters and definitive solutions. I also began training for a triathlon, something I'd always wanted to attempt but had never pursued because Grace considered endurance sports boring and time-consuming activities that took attention away from our social obligations and weekend plans she'd carefully curated around her Instagram content calendar. The swimming, cycling, and running created a rhythm that anchored my days in measurable progress rather than the unpredictable emotional terrain I'd been navigating for months without realizing it. Updates about Grace's life filtered through our mutual friends with the kind of reluctant regularity that happens when people feel obligated to keep you informed about someone's dramatic decline while pretending they're just making casual conversation. She'd briefly dated a travel blogger named Cooper who specialized in adventure tourism content and had convinced her to accompany him on several expensive trips that she'd documented extensively on social media with captions about embracing spontaneity and living authentically. The relationship had lasted exactly long enough for her to quit her marketing job and commit to a lifestyle of constant travel, at which point Cooper had abandoned her for a solo assignment documenting surf culture in New Zealand, leaving Grace stranded in Costa Rica with maxed-out credit cards and no return ticket home. Her parents had to wire money for her flight back, and she'd been forced to move back into their guest room while searching for new employment in a job market that wasn't particularly forgiving to people who'd walked away from stable positions to become travel influencers. The social fallout from our very public breakup had also affected her professional reputation, since several colleagues had witnessed her calculated performance at the anniversary party and begun questioning her reliability and emotional stability in workplace situations that required discretion and professionalism. Her attempts to rebuild her career were hampered by the fact that she'd burned bridges with several former clients during her brief travel blogging phase, prioritizing content creation over completing the marketing campaigns she'd been hired to develop. The unexpected twist in this already satisfying story of natural consequences emerged when my neighbor Mrs. Chen mentioned during our weekly conversation about building maintenance issues that she'd noticed a familiar car parked outside our building multiple times over the past month, always during hours when I typically arrived home from work or left for my morning training sessions. The description she provided matched Grace's silver Honda perfectly, And when I started paying attention to my surroundings more carefully, I began noticing the same pattern of surveillance that Mrs. Chen had observed. Grace was apparently conducting detailed reconnaissance of my daily routines, sitting in her car with a clear view of the building entrance while pretending to be on phone calls or checking her messages whenever other residents passed by her vehicle. The stalking behavior escalated when Grace's friend Melissa called me under the pretense of checking on my well-being, but the conversation quickly revealed its true purpose as an intervention attempt orchestrated by Grace herself. Melissa explained that Grace had been crafting elaborate plans to accidentally encounter me at locations she'd identified through her surveillance efforts, including my regular coffee shop where she discovered I stopped every Tuesday and Thursday morning before work, the gym where I'd been training for the triathlon, and even the grocery store where I shopped for weekly meal prep supplies. According to Melissa, Grace had been rehearsing casual conversation starters and planning her wardrobe for these manufactured chance meetings, complete with backup stories about why she happened to be in each location at precisely the times I was most likely to appear. The level of calculation required for this ongoing campaign of orchestrated encounters revealed that Grace's need for control and manipulation extended far beyond our relationship and into genuinely disturbing territory that suggested she'd never accepted the reality of our breakup. I quietly began adjusting my routines and documenting these stalking incidents with photographs and detailed notes about times and locations, realizing that Grace's inability to let go was probably going to require legal intervention if she continued escalating her efforts to force contact with someone who'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. Over the following year, Grace launched increasingly desperate attempts to re-establish contact that escalated from annoying to genuinely concerning as she demonstrated a complete inability to accept that our relationship was permanently over. The campaign began with anonymous flower deliveries to my office, always expensive arrangements with cards that contained no signature but featured quotes about second chances and forgiveness that were obviously meant to trigger memories of conversations we'd had during happier times in our relationship. When I stopped acknowledging these deliveries entirely, the tactics shifted to fake emergency calls where Grace would have friends contact me claiming she was in crisis and needed immediate support, only for me to discover through mutual acquaintances that she was perfectly fine and orchestrating these scenarios to force me into responding to her manufactured emergencies. The manipulation became so predictable that I started screening all unknown numbers and refusing to engage with any crisis that didn't come through official channels or verified family members who could provide concrete details about actual emergencies. Grace also created a false social media account under a completely fictional identity, complete with a manufactured backstory and borrowed photos, specifically designed to monitor my activities and interactions without revealing her true identity to me or anyone in my social circle. This fake persona would like and comment on my posts with just enough familiarity to make me suspicious, but never enough to definitively prove it was Grace behind the carefully constructed digital mask she was using to maintain surveillance of my personal life. The breakthrough came when she sent a handwritten letter to my apartment, bypassing all the digital barriers I'd established, written on expensive stationery that she'd probably spent considerable time selecting for maximum emotional impact. The letter claimed she'd been in intensive therapy for months and had finally realized that orchestrating our anniversary party breakup had been her rock-bottom moment, a desperate act of self-sabotage triggered by unresolved trauma from her childhood that had made her unconsciously destroy the best thing that had ever happened to her. She begged for just one coffee meeting where she could apologize properly and demonstrate the personal growth she'd achieved through professional help, promising that she wasn't trying to resurrect our relationship but simply needed closure to move forward with her healing process. The letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation disguised as genuine self-reflection, hitting every psychological trigger she knew would appeal to my sense of compassion and fairness while positioning her as a reformed person who deserved a chance at redemption. However, the most disturbing revelation came when I hired a private investigator to document the escalating harassment after Grace began showing up at locations where I'd never seen her before, suggesting she'd expanded her surveillance beyond my regular routines. The investigator uncovered that Grace had been telling people throughout our mutual social circle that we were on a temporary break rather than permanently separated, creating a false narrative that she was using to justify her ongoing pursuit and explain away my apparent coldness toward her innocent attempts at reconciliation. Even more troubling, she'd been actively sabotaging any woman who showed interest in me by spreading carefully crafted rumors about my supposed commitment issues and emotional unavailability, positioning herself as someone who understood my flaws but was willing to work through them, unlike these other women who couldn't handle my complexity. The investigator provided evidence of Grace approaching women I'd been casually dating and warning them that I was still hung up on my ex-fiancé and just using them as a rebound distraction, effectively poisoning any potential new relationship before it could develop naturally. Her final desperate move involved showing up at my office building during lunch hour, dressed professionally and carrying flowers while claiming to be there for a business meeting when building security questioned her presence in the lobby. She'd researched my company's client list and prepared a fake story about representing a potential partner organization, but her obvious nervousness and inability to provide specific details about the supposed meeting made security suspicious enough to call my office for verification. When they discovered she had no legitimate business in the building and was actually a former romantic partner attempting unauthorized contact, they escorted her out immediately and added her to their watch list of individuals not permitted on the property. I'd already filed a restraining order the week before based on the private investigator's documentation of her systematic harassment campaign, and this latest incident provided additional evidence of her complete disregard for legal boundaries and professional appropriateness. The harassment attempts revealed a level of delusion and entitlement that validated every decision I'd made that night at the anniversary party, confirming that Grace's inability to accept rejection gracefully was a fundamental character flaw that would have eventually manifested in our marriage even if I'd tolerated her manipulation tactics long enough to make it to the altar. 18 months later, I met Claire during a volunteer beach cleanup event organized by the local Marine Conservation Society, and our relationship developed with the kind of natural ease and mutual respect that my previous relationship had always lacked despite my efforts to force compatibility where none existed. Claire was a marine biologist specializing in coastal ecosystem restoration, someone who shared my genuine passion for ocean conservation rather than just tolerating my professional interests as Grace had always done with barely concealed boredom. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours as we worked side by side removing debris from a stretch of coastline near Monterey Bay, discussing everything from microplastic pollution to the engineering challenges of sustainable pier construction with the kind of intellectual connection I'd forgotten was possible between romantic partners. She was brilliant without being pretentious, funny without being cruel, and possessed a quiet confidence that didn't require constant external validation or carefully curated social media presence to maintain her sense of self-worth. We married in a small ceremony at the aquarium where Claire worked, surrounded only by people who genuinely supported our partnership rather than attending for social media opportunities or networking advantages. The guest list included my parents and closest friends, Claire's research colleagues who'd become genuine friends over years of shared fieldwork, and exactly 0 people who were there to document the event for their own entertainment rather than celebrate our actual commitment to each other. The ceremony itself reflected our shared values and interests, with vows we'd written together that focused on supporting each other's goals and building a life based on authentic connection rather than external expectations or performance for others. Claire wore her grandmother's simple pearl necklace instead of demanding expensive jewelry, and we served locally sourced food that reflected our environmental values rather than choosing the most Instagram-worthy options available. The entire celebration cost less than what I'd forfeited in deposits from my canceled wedding with Grace, but every detail felt meaningful because it represented choices we'd made together rather than compromises designed to satisfy someone else's vision of perfection. Claire was 6 months pregnant with our daughter Luna when we moved to a cottage near the coast, close enough to both our workplaces that we could walk to the beach every evening and watch the sunset without the noise and chaos of city life that had always left me feeling drained rather than energized. I experienced a profound contentment during those quiet months of preparation for parenthood, the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from building something real with someone who wants the same fundamental things from life. Claire never demanded expensive gifts or elaborate gestures to feel valued, instead finding joy in small daily rituals like our morning coffee on the deck overlooking the water and evening walks where we discuss our research projects and plans for raising our daughter near the ocean we both loved. The contrast with my previous relationship was so stark that I sometimes felt like I'd been living someone else's life during those years with Grace, pretending to enjoy social events and expensive dinners when what I actually craved was exactly the kind of quiet partnership Claire and I had built together. The most remarkable aspect of our relationship was how effortless everything felt when both people actually wanted to be there and contribute equally to creating something meaningful together. The twist that made our meeting feel almost destined rather than coincidental emerged when Claire mentioned that she'd actually heard about me through the local marine science community months before we met, where my professional reputation for innovative coastal engineering solutions and collaborative approach to environmental challenges had made me someone several colleagues had recommended she should meet when she relocated to the area for her new position. Our shared professional interests and values had created a foundation for connection that went far deeper than physical attraction or social compatibility, building toward a partnership that enhanced both our individual goals rather than requiring either of us to sacrifice our authentic selves for the sake of maintaining peace in the relationship. During a weekend visit to the Monterey Bay Marine Center with 2-year-old Luna, I spotted Grace watching us from behind the shark tank exhibit, looking disheveled and alone with dark circles under her eyes that suggested ongoing struggles with sleep or emotional stability that she was trying to mask with carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the underlying exhaustion. She'd clearly lost weight since I'd last seen her, not in a healthy way but in the manner of someone who'd been stressed beyond their normal coping mechanisms for an extended period, and her once perfect hair hung limp and unstyled in a way that would have horrified the image-conscious woman I'd once known. Luna was pointing excitedly at the hammerhead sharks when I noticed Grace moving closer through the crowd of weekend visitors, positioning herself where she could observe our family interaction while pretending to read the educational plaques about marine predators and their role in ocean ecosystems. The irony of her choosing the predator exhibit for her surveillance wasn't lost on me, though I doubted Grace possessed enough self-awareness to appreciate the symbolic appropriateness of her location choice for stalking her former partner and his new family. Claire was explaining the feeding habits of different shark species to Luna in the simplified but scientifically accurate way she had of making complex concepts accessible to our toddler, when Grace finally gathered enough courage to approach us directly rather than continuing her obvious but pathetic attempt at covert observation. Grace walked up cautiously with the kind of calculated vulnerability that had once been her signature manipulation tactic, though now it seemed more genuine desperation than strategic emotional positioning, and attempted to initiate small talk about Luna while commenting on how much she'd grown since the last photos I'd posted on social media before eventually congratulating me on my marriage with obvious difficulty and forced politeness. She mentioned that she'd heard about my marriage through mutual friends and social media posts she'd apparently been monitoring despite having no legitimate reason to maintain surveillance of my personal life years after our relationship had ended, then made awkward comments about Claire being lovely and our daughter being beautiful with the kind of strained enthusiasm that suggested she was forcing herself to be gracious while internally struggling with seeing tangible evidence of the happiness I'd found without her. The conversation felt surreal because Grace was attempting to present herself as someone who'd moved on and wished me well, but her presence at a location 3 hours from where she lived and worked suggested this encounter was as calculated and planned as every other interaction she'd orchestrated throughout our relationship and its aftermath. The devastating twist came when Grace revealed that she'd never actually moved on from our breakup and had been living in Monterey for the past 6 months, having relocated specifically to be near where she knew I'd settled with Claire after our marriage. She'd taken a position at a local marketing firm that represented several businesses in the area, including some that contracted with marine conservation organizations, which gave her legitimate professional reasons to be in the same geographic region while providing cover for what was essentially an elaborate stalking campaign disguised as career advancement. Grace admitted that therapy had helped her realize the anniversary party confrontation was her way of self-sabotaging something good out of fear of genuine intimacy, but she insisted that understanding her motivations had made her realize what she'd lost and how much she regretted destroying the best relationship she'd ever had for reasons that seemed incomprehensible to her now. She spoke about the series of failed relationships she'd had since our breakup. Men who'd either used her for temporary entertainment or been intimidated by her intensity, none of whom had offered the stability and genuine partnership I'd provided during our years together before she'd decided to detonate everything for dramatic effect rather than address her fears through honest communication. The desperation in her voice was real this time, unlike the calculated vulnerability she displayed during previous attempts at reconciliation, but it came too late and for entirely selfish reasons rather than genuine concern for the damage she'd caused. My response was simply a polite farewell and a suggestion that she take care of herself, delivered with the kind of calm finality that made it clear this conversation was ending immediately rather than developing into the extended emotional scene she'd probably been hoping to create in public where I'd be less likely to be harsh or dismissive. As we prepared to leave, Claire mentioned quietly that she'd noticed Grace following us through 3 different exhibits before finally approaching, confirming that this encounter had been as calculated and planned as everything else Grace had ever done, but that her surveillance skills had deteriorated along with her general emotional stability over the years since our breakup. Luna was getting tired and cranky from the crowds, so we made our way toward the exit while Grace lingered near the shark tank where we'd left her, probably planning her next move or trying to process the fact that her dramatic revelation about relocating to be near me had generated exactly 0 emotional response from the man she'd spent months positioning herself to accidentally encounter. Walking to our car with Claire's hand in mine and Luna babbling about the colorful fish she'd seen, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with Grace's pathetic attempt at reconciliation and everything to do with recognizing how completely I'd moved beyond the person I'd been when I thought her approval and affection were necessary for my happiness. The woman standing behind the shark tank represented a chapter of my life that had taught me valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation and valuing authentic connection, but she held no power over the authentic life I'd built with someone who chose to be there every single day rather than orchestrating dramatic scenes to prove her own importance.